So this is it, a general election.
Thank you very much to everybody, and good night.
We did it!
Will it ever get better than this again? Iranian missiles were fired in the last 20 minutes or so.
This is just unprecedented. I mean, people are picking up mud, throwing it at the king.
Hey, look what happened. Is this crazy?
2024, a year where around the world an often fragile peace was shaken. Regimes were overthrown, lands were invaded, and more wars began and ended. A seismic IT glitch cost businesses billions, and the year looks set to be the warmest ever recorded for the planet. But against this backdrop of fear, there were extraordinary new achievements in culture, technology, and exploration. And for half the world's population, 2024 was the year of the election. This is New Broadcasting House in central London, the heart of our national and international journalism. And these are some of our biggest stories from the last 12 months. One event in particular grabbed the world's attention, the US presidential election and that race for the White House. So let's cross the Atlantic and revisit one of the most roller coaster campaign years in recent US history.
President of the United States, Joe Biden.
With the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Mr. Biden vowed to continue as the Democratic candidate, but the gaffes proved too much. For much of the year, Donald Trump faced significant legal issues, not least his criminal trial stemming from a hush money payment to adult film actress Stormy Daniels.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial.
These are felony charges. This makes Donald Trump a convicted criminal. This gives him a criminal record. Never before in the history of this country has that ever happened.
Many Democrats were hoping they would be enough to sink his electoral hopes. But what happened next was startling. Gary O'Donoghue was there.
And you know, that's a little bit old, that chart. That chart's a couple
It was just a few minutes into Donald Trump's speech when a volley of shots rang out. The former president could be seen clutching at the right side of his head. After that, he hits the ground as the Secret Service pile on top of him, their job to put their bodies between him and the shooter. There was panic among the thousands of people inside the rally. Many ran, many threw themselves to the ground. Donald Trump was seen getting to his feet and raising a fist to his supporters, signs of blood at his right ear. He can be heard saying the words, "Fight, fight."
We noticed a guy crawling, bear crawling up the roof of the building beside us, 50 feet away from us. So we're standing there, and, we're pointing at the guy crawling up the roof.
And he had a gun, right?
He had a rifle.
A rifle.
We could clearly see him with a rifle, absolutely.
Joe Biden bowed out, and his vice president, Kamala Harris, took over the Democratic campaign. In the early days, the polls suggested a Kamala bounce and a tight race. We'll reflect on how election night actually unfolded later on. Next to India, and the biggest election the world has ever seen. 969 million people took part, and it took 6 weeks to complete. Narendra Modi's BJP-led National Democratic Alliance won the nation's general election, but with a much lower margin than predicted.
Something very dramatic has happened here in the last 2 minutes, which is that President Macron has dissolved Parliament and there are going to be elections here in a month.
France was gearing up for the Summer Olympics, but President Emmanuel Macron's decision to call a snap election gave the country something else to think about. Supporters of far-right political leader Marine Le Pen hoped this might be her moment. But instead, socialists did far better than expected. The resulting mess, parliamentary deadlock and a continuing political crisis was blamed on the French president. In the UK, weeks of speculation about when, finally ended when Prime Minister Rishi Sunak stepped into Downing Street to call a general election.
Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
But even the weather seemed to foretell bad tidings for the Conservatives.
So this is it, a general election is on. Power will leave this most powerful of streets, and you'll be able to decide whether he stays or whether he goes.
Frenetic campaigning followed. The Conservative Party appeared squeezed from all political directions, from Labour and from smaller parties like Reform UK. Living standards, health and immigration were all key issues that dominated the national debate. After 4 election defeats in a row and 14 years in opposition, polling showed Labour would score a sizable victory. Labour was clear about its key message. But was it what the people wanted?
I think everybody wants a change. Everybody's fed up with the way things are going.
Everything's stagnant at the moment, so I'm voting for change.
Just a general, honest government.
This is the main BBC News studio, and this is the place on election night, July the 4th, that was transformed into Downing Street for my colleagues Laura Koonsberg and Clive Myrie and that all-important exit poll.
And as Big Ben strikes 10, the exit poll is predicting a Labour landslide.
Blimey, just take a look and take in those numbers.
Teams of volunteers, the length and breadth of the country, raced to count ballots. The Lib Dems were delighted with their results, but from the Conservatives...
So thank you very much to everybody, and good night.
And from Labour...
We did it!
The aftermath of Georgia's election wasn't peaceful. The party Georgian Dream has governed there for the last 12 years, moving the country away from the European Union and closer to Russia. Despite being accused of fraud by the opposition, the ruling party claimed victory in the autumn election. That's when the government said it was suspending talks on joining the EU, and people headed out onto the streets.
Over there, the riot police started moving in. They're slowly marching towards the protesters. Riot police are in several areas, so they're closing in from this side. They're also on the side streets of the parliament, where some protesters continue to wave Georgian flags. And now they started, people are running away, and we have to run too. Come. Okay. Go, go, go. He says go, go, go.
The last 12 months have seen extraordinary developments in the Middle East. For many Syrians, the fall of President Bashar al-Assad's brutal regime was unthinkable, right up until the moment when it actually happened. Moving at astonishing speed, rebels launched an offensive from Idlib in the northwest, taking city after city as the army fled. In a matter of days, Assad lost his grip on the capital Damascus. After 24 years in charge, he escaped to Russia.
This is the moment where, both rebels and civilians are gathering in celebration of, the situation here after the toppling of the regime and departure of President Assad.
Hezbollah had been firing rockets and shells into northern Israel for many months, meaning thousands of Israelis had to be evacuated. It said its actions were a mark of solidarity with Hamas in Gaza to the south.
4:30 in the morning, and Israel's biggest attack on Hezbollah since the full-scale war back in 2006. Its military says around 100 fighter jets hit Hezbollah targets across southern Lebanon in what Israel says were preemptive strikes. For its part, Hezbollah says it fired more than 300 rockets and missiles across the border. Many were shot down by Israel's missile defense system. But some got through. This house was hit in the northern coastal town of Acre. Israel's Prime Minister convened his security cabinet, and the question, what happens next?
September brought extraordinary reports of explosions across Lebanon. Thousands of pagers, then walkie-talkies belonging to Hezbollah personnel had been booby-trapped by Israeli agents. A ground invasion by Israeli forces into southern Lebanon swiftly followed. And Israel's warplanes carried out strikes from above. Thousands were killed.
It's less than an hour since this airstrike was reported in Dahir in the southern suburbs of Beirut. And I just want to show you can see there, this is an apartment on the second floor, and you can really see the damage that's been caused.
Weeks later, on November the 26th, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire, brokered by the US and France.
This is the main road between Beirut and the south of the country. And for hours, thousands of people have been trying to go back to their homes. They say they haven't been defeated in this war and that this is a sign of victory.
April, and Iran launches an unprecedented strike on Israel. Iran claimed this was retribution for a strike on their consulate in Damascus. The Israeli military said 300 cruise missiles and drones were intercepted. But there was more to come.
Well, tonight, as we come on air, we bring you a breaking news story. Israel has been attacked by Iran. Iranian missiles were fired in the last 20 minutes or so. These are live pictures of the skyline of Tel Aviv this evening.
Hospitals struggled to treat the wounded. The shaking child. Slowly, he calls out. Habibi, you're strong, the nurse says. The bed is needed for someone else, so the child must wait on the floor. Hospitals in Jabalia are overwhelmed with casualties.
Through this year, we've seen the continuing consequences of the Hamas attacks on southern Israel in 2023, when some 1,200 people were killed and more than 250 taken hostage. Israel's full-scale invasion of Gaza has led to Hamas being largely destroyed as a fighting force. Its top leaders have been killed, and footage was even released of the last moments of Yahya Sinwar, chief mastermind of the 7th of October assault. But for more than 2 million Gazans, the ongoing war has meant more bloodshed, with more than 45,000 people now killed, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. There's widespread destruction and suffering. Most people are now displaced, and it's been a huge struggle to get aid to them. There is mass hunger and disease, including polio, which required a vaccination campaign. Like Hamas, Israel now faces accusations of war crimes, which it denies, and increased international isolation.
The blue screen of death. One day in July, one rogue software update. Up to 8.5 million computers using Microsoft systems crippled globally. People were stranded. GPs couldn't treat patients. Billions of dollars in revenue for businesses was lost. All eyes turned to the little-known cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike.
I want to apologize. We're deeply sorry.
In the last short while, news that several people have been stabbed in Southport.
The fatal stabbing of 3 young girls at a dance class was shocking. And then misinformation circulated on social media that the suspect was an illegal migrant. What followed escalated rapidly.
When the last half an hour things appear to have turned ugly, there have been windows smashed across the hotel. You can see hundreds of people in the streets. Police have been attacked, objects thrown at them, including fence panels pulled out from around the hotel, and things appear to be turning increasingly nasty.
Over several days, there was rioting across England and Northern Ireland. Hundreds were jailed for their actions.
See those chopsticks?
This was the historic moment that SpaceX caught a rocket booster on the launch pad.
Oh my goodness, they've done it. They've done it first time. That was absolutely astonishing.
One of the many moments this year when the private sector showed that it could do space just as well and cheaper than NASA.
Back at home, we all have a lot of work to do, but from here, Earth sure looks like a perfect world.
Billionaire Jared Isaacman became the first privately funded individual to walk in space.
And liftoff of
But it wasn't plain sailing for private industry. Astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams were sent to the International Space Station on a brand new spacecraft called Starliner, developed by Boeing. But because of technical issues, they couldn't come back on Starliner, leaving them there for months rather than weeks. But they didn't seem to mind. This year also saw NASA send a probe to one of the moons of Jupiter, called Europa, which has an unusual icy surface.
You can see cracks and ridges, which has been caused by Jupiter's powerful gravity stretching and squashing it. And it's that movement that scientists believe has melted the ice underneath to create a vast salty ocean.
China's Chang'e spacecraft landed on the far side of the moon and returned samples from the lunar surface to Earth. And on the ground there was a spectacular display of the Northern Lights, one of the great wonders of the universe.
When Ukraine's largest children's hospital was struck by a missile in July, all fingers pointed to Russia. 2 adults were killed and hundreds injured, including children. 1 month later, and there was a new development, as told by Steve Rosenberg.
It is an astonishing sight. Russian jets scrambling to bomb Russian territory. They're targeting Ukrainian troops who've attacked in large numbers across the border. It came out of nowhere. The Ukrainian assaults on Russia's Kursk region began on Tuesday. And suddenly, Russia's war had come much closer to home.
What is happening is huge. For the first time in more than 80 years, foreign troops are fighting on Russian soil.
When Vladimir Putin visited Kim Jong-un in North Korea in June, it was his first visit to the secretive regime in 24 years. A pact was signed to provide each other with mutual assistance. The world got a sense of what this pact meant when North Korean troops were spotted in Russia. Extreme weather swept around the world in 2024 with severe drought, fatal floods and disastrous cyclones. Scientific studies showed the fingerprints of human-caused climate change on these disasters. Whole communities consumed by water. More than 200 people killed. America's deadliest hurricane since Katrina. Hurricane Helene made landfall in Florida at the end of September and tore across the southeast of the country. More than half the deaths were in North Carolina.
Even before the officer got to me, the water was all the way up to my chest inside my car.
India, and one of the longest heat waves the country has ever recorded. Severe and unrelenting heat began in March and didn't let up for months. Temperatures in the north soared as high as 50 degrees Celsius. Spain, and a rising tide of anger. Accusations that authorities failed to relay flood warnings in time and weren't there fast enough for the cleanup.
This is just unprecedented. I mean, people are picking up mud, throwing it at the king. The depth of anger here, the fury is just extraordinary to see.
What Valencia experienced was Spain's worst floods for decades. More than 220 people died.
People that are not here have gone through a terrible agony until they died. Sorry.
Climate records continued to be broken. Summer 2024 was the Earth's warmest on record, according to the European Copernicus Climate Change Service. The same experts say the whole year is also set to be the hottest on record. At this year's main climate talks, wealthier countries agreed to finance poorer nations to the sum of $300 billion a year by 2035.
It was in the early hours of this morning when the key text was agreed. To huge applause from the room. But some delegates from developing countries were angry.
This, in our opinion, will not address the enormity of the challenge we all face.
The Post Office Horizon scandal is described as the UK's most widespread miscarriage of justice.
Over more than a decade, over 900 sub-postmasters were prosecuted for stealing. Many went to prison. Many were financially ruined. To get to the truth, the public inquiry into the scandal heard from key participants.
Former post office boss Paula Venel starting her 3 days of evidence,
Are you a liar, Miss Venel?
distancing herself from any wrongdoing.
I was too trusting. I'm disappointed where information wasn't shared.
But the barristers for the sub-postmasters didn't hold back.
Looking under that rock, you're going to find a problem. It's going to devastate the post office, ruin it. You couldn't let that happen, could you, Miss Venel?
I loved the post office. I gave it...
April saw horses running loose through central London. The household cavalry animals were spooked by the sound of construction work.
And it's all these horses galloping along. It's a very surreal thing to see.
In music, it was a year of disruption and upheaval, starting at the Brit Awards, where Ray won a record-breaking 6 prizes, 2 years after a painful split from her record label.
After having years of your dreams being frustrated, tonight they've come true, right?
Yeah, tonight, this has been a night of my life. Will it ever get better than this again?
Edgy female pop continued to set the agenda, from Sabrina Carpenter to Chapel Rowan. But Charlie XCX ruled the roost with the hedonistic yet vulnerable Brat, which even influenced the US presidential election. Beyoncé went country on her latest album, Cowboy Carter, adding a record 99th Grammy nomination to her belt buckle. Taylor Swift shattered records again with the year's biggest selling album and a tour that generated $2 billion in ticket sales. As for the men, Drake and Kendrick Lamar squared up for a headline-making rap battle. They not like us, they not like us, they not like us. Taking the opposite approach, Noel and Liam Gallagher buried the hatchet after a 15-year strop. Their reunion tour kicks off in Cardiff in June.
Good morning, this is BBC News just after 7 a.m. here in Philadelphia, and you can see already long lines of people forming to cast their vote on Election Day here in America. Well, the queues were huge in all of those key battleground states, and then of course the world waited for the result. And that night our galleries here in London were linked up with the US, and we're doing that again because our senior North America correspondent Gary O'Donoghue is with me. And Gary, that big election programme was coordinated right where you are.
This room was packed to the rafters with people coordinating all those various feeds from around the country. People like me at the Donald Trump HQ, my colleagues around the various swing states.
Jade, could you play us a bit more of our coverage from that night, please?
It is 7 p.m. here in Washington, midnight in London, and we are off to the races. We have our...
And Gary, what was the atmosphere like at Trump headquarters where you were at that moment?
Bit by bit during the evening, people started to come into the convention centre. There was a big bar at the back. They were drinking a lot of beer. And as the results started to come in, they got more and more animated.
And then there was that moment where Donald Trump came out on stage.
And so Donald Trump is there on stage, surrounded by his family, surrounded by his key supporters.
This is all over bar the shouting. Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. He will be only the second man in history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms.
Hey, look what happened. Is this crazy?
Gary, you were there for some of the biggest moments of that campaign. How would you sum it all up, but also look ahead to what might come next?
I don't think there's any question that this was an extraordinary moment in American political history. He'd done something that no one had done before. He'd come back from being a felon, a convicted felon, facing multiple other legal charges and legal court cases, Someone had tried to assassinate him twice in that year. He was an incredibly controversial figure, still an incredibly controversial figure, yet he managed to win the presidency. That is a huge American story, and it's an American story that's not yet finished, because as we head into the new year, we wonder, what will he do with this second term? How different will it be? Promises made, promises kept is what he said on the night, and some of those promises are incredibly worrying for a lot of Americans, and they're going to be incredibly impactful for the rest of the world.
As we watch developments around the globe, the role that the new US president plays will be a significant one. And our newsrooms, journalists and correspondents across the world will keep on bringing you the biggest stories.